Welcome to Peoples and Things, where we explore human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel. Heyo! Before we get cracking, here a little bit of business. If you like this podcast, one thing you could do to help us out is leave us a 5-star rating and maybe even a little brief review on whatever platform you get your podcast from. I've been told once again that these things actually matter. So if you've got the time and energy, we would really appreciate it. Okay, business over. Hey, do you remember when ChatGPT was released to the public in November 2022? Holy smokes, huh? Wow. The energy that moment created, the crazy amounts of energy. There was clearly a lot of extreme hype then and now, but also it seemed like something real had changed. I still stand by my early writings on the topic, including in the summer of 2023, that when it comes to how businesses may shift their practices around generative AI tools, we still don't know where things are at. And probably won't for at least a few years. But I also remember friends sending me panicky DMs and big statements being made in major news outlets about how these tools were going to negatively affect education. I still don't think we know where we're at on that front either. But one thing's clear. If your work as a teacher often relied on having students write in response to a prompt, and you didn't do a lot of work on what they wrote before the prompt or after the prompt, well, you're going to have to change things. Because ChatGPT and similar tools can do a fine job writing a crappy essay in response to your crappy essay prompt. Often as good or better job than many students can do. And you know what? Changing practices can be really difficult for teachers who are already overwhelmed and overworked. That's true. That's facts. One of the few people I've been finding interesting on the topic of how generative AI could and should impact teaching and learning is John Warner. John Warner is an interesting guy. He's a writer, editor, and someone who taught writing at the college level for more than 20 years. He was also an editor at the periodical McSweeney's, which was very important for my generation in all kinds of ways. John is the author of 3 books on writing and education: The Writer's Practice, Why They Can't Write, and Sustainable, Resilient, Free, which is about the future of public higher education. Today, he's perhaps best known for his Substack, The Biblio Oracle Recommends. What I like about John's approach to the topic of generative AI is that this is a guy who has been beating up on the kind of standard short college essay for years. He thinks the short college essay has been a bad news for a long time. And so when you hear him talk about ChatGPT and the like, one of his messages is that these new technological tools undermine things that were already not going well. And so these new technologies should act as a kind of clarion call for us to improve our work. They are invitations for us to do better. Now, I'm not going to tell you where I put the odds of us professors and K-12 teachers actually accepting the offer of this invitation and doing better, because I don't want to be depressing. But I think John, who's currently working on a book on teaching writing in the age of AI that you'll hear about in this interview, is on the right track. And it's for this reason, amongst other reasons, I so enjoyed talking to him, as you'll see. Hey, get excited! John, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Oh, my pleasure.
So we're steering this ship towards a conversation about the impacts of generative AI use on higher education, teaching, and learning. But what I like about your approach, which I've learned a lot from, including just from your tweets on this stuff, is that you seem to think that ChatGPT exacerbates problems we've had in education for a long time, which I that's where my belly rests too. So let's set generative AI panics aside for a moment. What do you think's been wrong with the way we teach writing, as you've explored in why they can't write in other works?
So the biggest thing is we've sort of, in an effort around standardizing and tracking and ranking students, we've boiled writing down to a series of surface level indicators that has created what is essentially a almost purely behaviorist model around writing. So in order to score well on these assessments, you need to have a thesis at the end of the first paragraph. You can never use I. You can't use contractions. You have to have 3 body paragraphs, each with a transition word or phrase starting them. And then a conclusion that starts with "in conclusion," no matter how short or long the piece of writing was, right? This is the 5-paragraph essay that I go after as the sort of avatar of these problems in why they can't write. But as I noticed over the 20 or so years I was teaching writing, including 3 years at Virginia Tech in your communication department, was that the attitudes students had towards writing were steadily degrading because essentially what they were asked to do is create what I call writing-related simulations. So they do behaviors that result in text that can then be assessed according to this very, very surface level criteria that is then passed with a sort of a B. Everybody gets a B because nobody's even given an opportunity to say anything interesting. And then we just sort of move on and keep punting students down the road and pat ourselves on the back as though this is learning. But this is not learning how to write. This is not the sort of thinking that we do when we write. So my worries long predated ChatGPT. Why they can't write, I wrote in 2017 and 2018, came out at the end of 2018. And when ChatGPT showed up and it starts churning out the standard school essay, like it's nothing. I'm like, of course it can do that because it's been trained on the simulations students are doing. So the simulation is copying the human simulations, and we're freaking out about it because the criteria that we have used to say, oh, this kid knows what they're doing, this one doesn't, is not particularly meaningful or important. Yeah. Certainly not, it's not how we respond to writing in the world, right? And it's certainly not important in terms of developing students' critical thinking and writing abilities.
Yeah. So, you say that teachers need to get out of the essay business in one place. So what's wrong with the essay, man? Why are you always beating up?
I mean, so my students write tons of essays, but I don't call them essays because, so one of the things that happened over time was students began to equate essay with 5-paragraph essay.
Yeah.
And so they started asking questions like, can I use I? Or am I allowed to use contractions? These sorts of shortcuts that they'd been told by teachers in order to get a good grade.
Yeah.
So just the word with students came with all kinds of baggage. So I stopped using it. But then when I stopped using it, I'm like, well, what are these things? What are the activities that help students learn to write? And what I settled on was experiences. We're going to have writing experiences. Now, the end result may be often is something that looks a lot like an essay. It is an essay, but the origins of essay, like Montaigne's work and this sort of stuff, was sort of to explore, right? Yeah. To wander. And why not? My feeling became, why not allow students to wander? Let them struggle with a writing experience, something that is rooted in a genuine rhetorical situation with an audience, a message, and a purpose. Let them do that under a structured activity, and then see what they learn. Often it's messy. Often it's disappointing. Yeah, as compared, right, to when I was engaging in like highly prescriptive methods, not like 5-paragraph essay. Like I went much deeper than that. I was like, if we're going to do a rhetorical analysis, here's what every sentence in the first paragraph should be doing, and you should be doing that. And that could sort of ride herd over students towards a decent grade, but it wasn't helping them learn to write. And when I got away from those methods, it became much more about being comfortable with students producing something that does not look great against the measurements of school, but is interesting and valuable in terms of their learning, particularly for themselves, right? It gives them something to reflect on about what they're learning and what they're doing.
I have a couple follow-ups on that. I mean, so do you think your prompts look different than most others? I mean, how do you kind of frame, the front end of it?
So all of this, I ultimately collected all of these in the book I did after Why They Can't Write, The Writer's Practice. But yes and no. I mean, there's only so much you can do, right? Like there's nothing terribly groundbreaking about my approach. It's process-based problem solving around writing. This is stuff that, rhetoric and composition scholars will tell you has been sort of standard operating procedure in the field for decades. Unfortunately, the field has not trickled down into the world. In Why They Can't Write, I talk about this essay by Richard Larson that was in college English in 1982, talking about how the futility of assigning the high school research paper, how this is a bad way of learning how to write. I was 12 years old when this paper was released, right? And I spent all of my middle school and high school years writing these exact things that there's a sound argument for not doing. So the biggest thing I do is, rather than saying to students, you're going to write a rhetorical analysis, or you're going to do a summary and response, or you're going to write a research paper, is that I start with a question. So every assignment starts with a question. And one I do early in the semester is ultimately they write a review of something. And the question is just, should I? Should I go to this movie? Should I eat at this restaurant? Should I go to this coffee shop? Should I buy these shoes? And that starts students down a problem-solving route, right? Where you have to start to think of audience. You have to gather information. You have to do research. You have to observe the world. And these are all behaviors that ultimately aggregate under what I call the writer's practice, the skills, knowledge, attitudes, and habits of mind of writers. And so everything they're going to do is going to practice the practice. And so and make them aware of those things, right? Like when you go to a restaurant and you start taking notes, you're doing, you're practicing the skill of observation. This is a fundamental thing that writers, anybody has to do. And so, by framing it around the experience and activity, it does bust students a little bit out of that I'm writing something for school, which I think is a mindset that is counterproductive to learning because of the patterns they've become accustomed to in completing that work. But really at its core, all I'm having them do is write. There's nothing, I wish, when the book came out, somebody said, well, now you got to go do your study. You got to get an independent variable and show how great your method is, because that's how you're going to sell a gazillion copies of this thing. I'm like, it doesn't work that way. There's no independent variable I can reduce this to. This is simply writing. And so that's what students are going to do. And the results are going to be all over the map. Just like it should be. And this is what's going to happen.
So let's double back for a second. How'd you end up becoming this guy who writes about these things? I mean, so you taught writing for 20 something years. But you're also an editor at McSweeney's, is that right?
I was, yeah.
Yeah, which is, I think for my generation, like this really important housing of style and thinking and such. So yeah, tell us a bit about your trajectory.
Well, I mean, it's really accidental. I have a MA in literature and an MFA in creative writing. Both, it was at sort of a 2-for-1 degree that I went and did because I didn't want to work anymore in the job I had after college as a paralegal, where I discovered law school wasn't my future. So I went and sort of just escaped and did that for 3 years. Got married to the person I had been dating all that time. After that, when she's a veterinarian, she finished vet school, moved back to Chicago, where we're from. I have a really good job at a market research firm. I sort of learned that all these skills I had analyzing literature and creative writing translate to market research. But then my wife decided she wanted to specialize, so she had to go back to school, do an internship year at University of Illinois, and then 3 years of residency at your institution, Virginia Tech. And so I just started teaching again. I had taught as a graduate student Took a job as a lecturer at University of Illinois. I'm like, I like this. Like teaching is a fascinating problem to me. It's a lot like writing, right? Like it's a series of trial and error where error you can attempt to remedy that and try again. And really, I'm not sort of blowing smoke up your institution because you're from Virginia Tech and I'm there, but it really was my experience at Virginia Tech that transformed how I look at these things. I was teaching in the communication department there, a course called Com Skills, which I'm confident still exists. And under the sort of direction of the course, a professor named Marlene Preston, who sort of created this course out of thin air. She's now retired, although she's still in the area. And it was a year-long course that combined like first-year writing, freshman composition, and public speaking. And one of the things I sort of clued into teaching those courses in consecutive semesters was it's all the same. It's all the same. Communication is communication.
Yep.
Writing is communication. Public speaking is communication. The kinds of thinking we have to do to succeed in those contexts are no different.
Yeah.
And so what I started teaching was essentially a method around problem solving in communication contexts. And then when I left and my wife took a job in Greenville, South Carolina, and I wound up at Clemson for 6 years, I just realized that the sort of academization of writing that students do in college was not a good fit with what they actually needed to learn. So I abandoned it. And being a non-tenure track faculty member is, it's not great in a lot of ways. You don't make a lot. You don't have a lot of job security. You're often teaching the courses nobody else wants to teach, though those are the courses that I sort of enjoyed most. But it also means, I used to say, freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. Right.
Yeah.
And nobody was paying attention to anything I was doing. I wasn't evaluated. I wasn't watched. I could do anything I wanted. And so I just started like messing around with the courses I was teaching. And like my background at McSweeney's and writing humor, I'm like, all right, we're going to write jokes.
Yeah.
Because that's a good way to learn how to target an audience. I'm going to ignore the recommended sequence for this, and I'm going to do what I think is good. And I just saw results. I saw results, particularly around student attitudes for writing. Students were eager to think. Students are eager to express themselves. Students are eager to understand the world. And so then when I arrived we left Greenville and moved to Charleston, South Carolina, and I started teaching at College of Charleston. I'm just like, this is my lab now. I'm going to experiment. And that ultimately resulted in, this sort of pedagogical approach that once I left teaching full time, it's a sad story with maybe a happy ending. I applied for a tenure track job at College of Charleston in creative writing that I did not get, even though I'd been visiting faculty there for 5 years at the time. And it was the kick in the pants that I needed to sort of say, like, teaching off the tenure track is not a career, right? As much as I like teaching. So I wrote those 2 books. And for a university press book, Why They Can't Write did really well. The writer's practice is used in a bunch of classrooms. But really what I was sort of most gratified by was it was as though there was a whole significant cohort of other people like me out there who had been wondering about, like, do we need to do it this way? Does this make sense? Yeah. Does doing a 6-week-long research paper as the culmination of first year writing that is disappointing for everybody, right? Particularly the students, right? Like I used to, I would do like the big research paper, and they were doing well before that. They're like hyped for it, and they come with the top, total freedom for topics and good research, and they would come in and, I'd do the first thing I would do in class was like, 3 of you are going to tell me something interesting you read in your research for your research paper. And they'd be like, oh man, this is so cool. And then they would write these things and I would read them. And then at the end of every semester, I'd do a one-on-one conference with every student after I'd read it and their sort of end of semester portfolio. And they would walk in and they would have a sheepish look. They'd be like, oh man, I don't know. They'd be like, well, what, how do you feel about this? And the students would be like, I don't know, man. It didn't come together.
Yeah.
It didn't work. It seemed really interesting and I felt good about it, but then I just had to pull it. And, think about it. Could you leave Vinsel in 6 weeks, starting from scratch, write even a relatively short researched piece of writing, 2,000, 2,500 words, on a topic with which you are interested, but mostly unfamiliar, citing, 6, 8, 10 sources along the way, integrating them into your own original argument or interpretation of the evidence. Could you,
well, you got all these other things going on in life.
This is not your full-time job,
exactly.
right? This is I don't know what one course is, maybe at best 15% of a student's semester while you're doing all these other things. And I just sort of had an epiphany of like, oh yeah, that's impossible.
Yeah.
I'm asking them to do something that is actually not associated with success and learning. And so what can I do instead? Mm-hmm. And that's ultimately where the writer's practice came from. Everything we're going to do is going to be under this umbrella of a writer's practice. Uh-huh. Students are going to understand what they're building. They're going to reflect on what they're building. And at the end of the semester, they're going to tell me what they know. Mm-hmm. That's how we're going to know something good happened. And it was liberating. I mean, it extended my teaching career by 5 or 6 years. And if I hadn't had the disappointment of not getting that job, I'm sure I'd still be doing it.
Yep.
Just because it made that work interesting, and possible. I think that's the challenge. Particularly if you're a lecturer like I was, it's like you have too many students. You don't have enough time.
Totally.
So. Yeah, it was. I mean, it was haphazard. It was really like I've been following my wife's career, and I've had to stay busy. Uh-huh. And I've always written along the way. I've written a bunch of books, but I learned pretty quickly that I am the wrong guy to sit at home and write books full time. It drives me crazy.
Interesting.
It ups the pressure. Like I'm working on my next book now, but all told, it's going to be about a 6-month process to do that. Mm-hmm. That's good for me. 6-month sprint to write a book from scratch, that works.
Yep.
Stretching this out forever, it doesn't. I like a little novelty, I guess.
Yeah.
And fresh things. So yeah. There's no, sometimes I'm invited to give talks about like making a career as an English major in the world.
Oh God.
And, I just say like, be interested, be curious, understand that you actually have skills that translate, and you can do stuff, wake up in the morning looking forward to what you're going to have to do that day. That's sort of my big advice.
Where'd you grow up around in Chicago?
I grew up in the Chicago suburbs, a place called Northbrook, and the shorthand for people knowing it is if you've seen the movies of John Hughes, like Breakfast Club, 16 Candles, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, those were filmed in my hometown, basically, while I was about the age of the protagonists. I'm a little younger than I think 16 Candles came out when I was 14, but that was basically like the Breakfast Club was based on weekend attention from my high school, and all those stereotypes were my high school. So
right on.
That's exactly. I would tell my students, if you want to know my childhood, watch those movies. It was white, it was privileged, it was filled with the angst of white privileged people.
I'm a Chicagolander too, so that's why I ask. Maybe it's our Midwesternness that is part of my identification with you.
There is something to that. I think there is a willingness, like the Midwestern mentality of sort of like, I'll listen, but I might not believe.
Yeah. Exactly.
I think it's been useful, and I'm familiar with your work in reverse. Like there is something about like, just hold on a second.
Yeah.
Right. Like, are we sure that this is a good idea? Particularly around technology, right? Like I think Midwesterners are less prone to falling for hype than.
Yeah, I think that's right. So this might sound like a pedantic question to listeners, but I ask you because I know you write about it. But let's put this in what is the purpose of school? Because I think that's actually an important question for thinking through like what we're doing around these things, right? So what's school for in your view?
So you froze again. You froze there for me. So maybe just start from this is a pedantic question.
Oh yeah, sure. So this might sound like a pedantic question to listeners, but I ask because I know you've written about it. What is the purpose of school? Right? What, in your view, like what are we trying to do here that guides our thinking about what to do with writing?
So to me, as an individual, from my set of values, this is a very straightforward question. And the answer is to learn stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not wholly agnostic about what those things are, but I'm open to a wide range under that umbrella, right? But essentially, to learn to think, to learn about ourselves, to essentially, answer the questions of like, who am I and how do I do this stuff that I'm being asked to do? And this stuff beyond like factoring binomials, stuff like existing in the world, right? Figuring out what you want to do. I take that for granted. And yet when we look at school as it is structured, particularly as it has evolved over the course of my career teaching college and seeing students come in with different experiences from mine, right? I'm 53 years old. I went to grade school in the 70s and 80s. It was a different time. School has become much more about schooling than learning, right? This sort of behaviorist model that students have internalized as the point of school is to do good in school. And so whatever behaviors help me do good in school is what I should do. I actually, it feels like old home week, thinking about Virginia Tech, talking to you. But I remember teaching at Tech. This would have been, you can look it up after the show, but it would have been somewhere around 2003, 2004, the first cohort of freshmen to come in who had been subjected to the Virginia Standards of Learning criteria, who had to pass those tests to graduate. And I had a student in my comm skills class who was salutatorian of her high school, so number 2 ranked GPA, who had to take the English SOL 4 times to pass it because she just had a sort of horrible test anxiety, right? And that student had experienced a kind of trauma around writing. And we had to work on that in comm skills to help her overcome that. Perfectly bright, super diligent, right? The salutatorian of a high school is nothing if not a diligent on top of its student. And at the time I was sort of like, well, that sucks. that we shouldn't do that. And little did I know, sort of between 2004 and today, it would only increase and spread in terms of that sort of attitudes towards school, right? The standards of learning were rooted in George W. Bush's No Child Left Behind laws, and only exacerbated by Barack Obama's race to the top. And this is the bipartisan effort to separate schooling from learning. All of those bad incentives around, like, can't take art anymore because you got to practice for the test. You can't have recess because you got to practice to the test. My hope is that the arc is bending back away from that, as sort of people have done research around. Oh, what's good for learning? Playing an instrument, because it's fun and it helps with your neuroplasticity or whatever. I don't even care about any, like,
right. Whatever BS you need to believe to do it.
I don't I believe it's true. Yeah. I believe it's true, but I don't care because I know from witnessing and working with students for a long, long time, like, they are human beings first. So to give students a human experience is, to me, the best route towards learning. Yeah. But you need a school that values learning, and you need students that value learning. And they increasingly arrive in college a little suspicious of that, right? A
Yeah.
little like, are you sure? Like when they come into my first year writing class, I'm like, we're gonna, I'm not gonna put a grade on anything you write, and we're gonna reflect, and we're gonna talk about this, and you're gonna submit a portfolio at the end,
Yeah.
and we're gonna reach a consensus, you and I, the student and I, about your grade. And they're like, get out of here. That's
Yeah.
ridiculous, right? That
Yeah.
is not anything. I'm like, I think you're gonna learn more. And there's students who experience the semester and like, hey man, I get what you're doing. I appreciate it. I'm on board, but yeah, you're wrong. Like school is to check these boxes and get somewhere else.
Yeah.
And to me, that's kind of sad. Like,
Yeah.
I don't blame them. I don't judge, I don't judge the students for doing what they can to survive, but it's like, yeah, we have to have a conversation about what school is for.
Yeah.
Particularly when we now have this technology that can like do school for
Right.
students.
Right.
Right.
Let's go there in 1 second. One thing I really like about your work is that, you really have like you really go from the micro to the macro. So you have these books where you go into the very detailed stuff about how to work at the fine grain, but you also have this much broader vision of education. And so, I mean, I think you've already started going down that road, but, I'm going to ask you something kind of really unfair, but can you give us a sense of the vision you put forward in your book, Sustainable, Resilient, and Free, about like, the subtitle is The Future of Public Higher Education. So, I mean, how do you think about that bigger issue of like where we are in higher ed right now?
Yeah. The key word there is, for me, it's sustainable, right?
Yep.
The, colleges and universities of our country, including ones like Virginia Tech, like I don't know if Virginia Tech is considered a flagship because you have University of Virginia, but it's a large state university, highly selective.
R1, all that.
R1 depends on recruiting out-of-state students
Totally.
to balance the books, right?
Yep.
I don't know if Virginia Tech is majority out-of-state, but
basically, yeah, I think
so.
Like
Clemson is majority out of state. Yeah. University of Alabama is majority out of state. One of the things I experienced when I moved from Virginia Tech to Clemson was students at Clemson from Virginia who did not get into Virginia Tech,
mm-hmm.
And there were students at Virginia Tech who could not get into Clemson.
Yep.
This is a compliment to both institutions. There are no two institutions more similar in the country than Virginia Tech and Clemson in terms of the type of student who goes there, what happens when you're there. I mean, the big difference may be Virginia Tech has the Corps of Cadets, but other than the sort of embedded military college, they're very, very similar. Football, you go to the grocery store during the football game because it's empty.
Yeah.
Like this is the
my drill.
They couldn't be more alike.
Yeah.
Right. And yet students who should be able to get into Virginia Tech from Virginia don't. They have to go to Clemson. So these institutions are forced to compete for students.
Yep.
And this is not a sustainable way of operating for a system of higher education. Now, there may be some winners, right?
Mm-hmm.
Virginia Tech and Clemson being relative winners
mm-hmm.
within this arena because they are able to compete
mm-hmm.
for those students. But it creates a permanent underfunded underclass under those. And it harms the relative winners because all of that energy that goes into like recruiting students and finding ways to up revenue and keep the books balanced are not directed towards teaching and learning or research or the things that an R1 university is supposed to do. And really, my view is that it's only a matter of time before more and more schools start to look like West Virginia University, right? Which essentially created an unsustainable financial approach and became an opening for the people who want to get rid of things like the humanities to do so. This is going to happen at the University of Arizona, which mismanaged its own finances. It's happening at the University of Connecticut, which has a harder time competing for out-of-state students. I think Storrs, Connecticut, I've been there. It's like it's actually a nice little town with a great university, but it's not Tuscaloosa on a Saturday in the fall,
Yeah.
right? And where the parties happen and students get to have that life in addition to also getting their degree. So key is sustainability, and sustainability has to be around the stuff universities are supposed to do, which is teach and research and be resources to the community around them, right? Like, having lived in Blacksburg for 3 years, Blacksburg is a beautiful, beautiful spot, right? Like it's a amazing place that is enhanced 1,000-fold by having an R1 university there in terms of culture, in terms of employment, in terms of access to technology, all of that stuff. And this happens all across the country at much smaller towns with less prestigious universities like the University of Wisconsin, Menominee, or Stout, or Whitewater, these sorts of places. These are key aspects of these communities. They educate the people who come from these places. And making the University of Wisconsin Whitewater compete for students makes no sense, right? And as I talk in the book, in aggregate, if you add up state money, federal money, all the money that goes to like Pell Grants to try to make education marginally more affordable, if you add all that up, and then you kick in a little more from taxing our billionaire private brethren, stop giving them breaks on their endowments, stop giving them breaks on the property taxes that they should owe as essentially, almost $1 trillion corporations that they work as. Maybe grab a little from them, a little Robin Hood action. Add that with the money we already spend on public education, and you could make any public institution of 2 years or 4 years tuition free. And it would be more efficient. It would allow for more of that money and resources to go towards the things we claim we want universities to do.
Yeah.
It could not be Sustainable, Resilient, Free is quite a slim little book. it's like 160 pages in small paperback. Like it's not complicated.
Yeah.
But it's really a matter of like the difference between teaching and learning. There's a huge portion of the world that is wrapped up in this notion of competition, of sort of elite meritocracy, right? All the attention we pay to the Ivy Plus universities as though they're representative of what happens in the world.
Yeah.
You can testify to this, like Virginia Tech, a highly ranked elite R1 university, is still nothing like Harvard or Yale,
Princeton or whatever,
or Princeton or University of Chicago. It's simply, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's something like what they call the Ivy Plus institutions is something like 0.15% of all higher ed enrollment. Yeah. We have to sort of stop defining higher education by those places and start looking at what are the places students actually go, what do they need to do? I think the gap between that vision and reality is probably larger than it ever has been.
Yeah.
At this moment, I think it was my thesis in the book was it's shrinking during COVID because we actually see the necessity of these places, and we have a sort of public spirit around coming together very briefly.
Yeah.
And the COVID money, we're like, oh, look at what happens when people have enough to live on and they don't have to worry about these kinds of things.
Yeah, man.
All that got blown out of the water. and in the culture war, the convenience of the culture war is a political weapon.
Yeah.
And universities as a target game. And it's like, I have a chapter in the book about navigating the culture war issues and how I think universities should do. And I think they do it quite, this is not blaming universities for what are almost entirely bad faith attacks.
Sure.
But the way universities tend to respond to them are not helpful to.
I totally agree with you.
The university.
We could talk about that for hours, I'm afraid. I totally agree with you. So let's take, we've had this conversation about teaching writing, and then we've connected it to these larger themes in education. Now let's rewind like a little over a year and like drop generative AI into this hot mess. And I don't know about what your experience was, but I had, because of who I am with technology stuff, I had friends writing me and like, oh, this time it's different. Everything is going to blow up.
They want to convince the great skeptic that all of a sudden the breakthrough has happened.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. And like, I think, obviously some things have shifted in the sense of, I'm very realistic about, I think the business side of it is still an open question. I think there's a lot of reasons to continue to be skeptical. If the statement is the appearance of these tools better shift the way we assign essays and such in college classrooms, I'm like, well, yep, because it does as good or better than the students on this crap. So yeah, so tell us a bit, you're writing a book on this. Tell us a bit about what you're up to. Tell us the title and, how are you thinking about this stuff?
So the title of the book is More Than Words, How to Think About Writing in the Age of AI. And it really is that subtitle that I think is the key to where my attitude towards this stuff has evolved since its appearance, right? Whatever it was, 13, 14 months ago now. How to think about it, right? Because, when ChatGPT showed up, I was freaked out because, particularly because I had played around with 2.5. ChatGPT, I think it's 3.5, right? The 3.5 release of this GPT technology. I played around with 2.5 and couldn't have been less impressed. I was like, this stuff is an interesting gibberish generator.
Yeah,
it could not respond to a prompt in really a coherent way. It would have strings of sensible syntax, but not necessarily responsive syntax. And it really looked like a more sophisticated, version of the monkeys pounding at the typewriters.
Yeah.
But not much more. 3.0 I looked at, and all of a sudden, okay, well, 3.0 can, if you're not paying attention, it can give you something that you might give a C minus. Or if you're wedded to uninteresting, unchallenging prompts, this thing might be able to fool you.
Yep.
With something. And one of the things that made 3.0 sort of more plausible in a way was its syntax was not so polished. And so it sometimes looked goofy in ways that student syntax does when they're trying to write for school, when they're trying to impress. But failing, writing what I call pseudo academic BS, which is sort of like this attempt to sound smart, where you hit control click on a word to call up the thesaurus so that you can get the $10 word instead of the 10-cent one. But then ChatGPT shows up and it's like, oh, this thing can crank out a B minus in a heartbeat. Now, there's nothing interesting about it. It's literally featureless in terms of ideas. It's like there's nothing like human writing when it's good. I describe it as being spiky. Like there's certain features that grab your interest and make you want to read it. There's nothing in the sort of the standard ChatGPT output, but it is syntactically correct.
Yeah,
it is generally responsive, and by the criteria against which students were often evaluated, it is, as you say, better, but the other word you used was crap.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's only because our, student writing is often so, comparably poor in some respects, right? That this thing looks,
It's students struggle making syntactically smooth, coherent sentences.
Yep.
Because as I say over and over again, I said it in Why They Can't Write. I'm going to say it I'll be on my deathbed and be like, writing is thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
So if writing is thinking, when the thinking is hard, your writing becomes at the surface level less fluent.
Right.
And when students, particularly students at a place like Virginia Tech who are well-prepared college students, right? We're not talking about developmental English, which I started teaching. my first experiences were teaching developmental English. This is not lack of practice at making sentences. When the syntax is off, it's really like, I don't know what I'm trying to say. And
yeah,
ChatGPT doesn't wrestle with that problem because it doesn't think. And so it's just this syntax unspooling machine. And so the freak out is understandable. It's like, oh my God, that looks a lot like what my students do, only better.
Right.
In those surface ways, right? In those proxies we've allowed to stand in for learning. Underneath it, though, not much interesting is happening.
No.
My initial freak out didn't last very long as I sort of pushed it and put it through its paces.
Yeah.
And ultimately it is a question of values. There was an essay in the Chronicle by an English professor who wrote very honestly and forthrightly about his experiences looking at GPT and said, yeah, this does what I've asked my students to do, but really what I've been asking my students to do is bullshit.
Exactly. Yeah. This is how I feel. This is how I feel.
And it wasn't even news to him.
Yeah.
Part of it, he writes, when I would grade my students' writing, part of me would die inside a little while he was grading. And, my question for those folks is, why were you doing an activity in your class that makes you want to die inside? Die a little inside when you're reading it.
I'm dying a little inside right now.
Yeah. Like what is that? What is that?
Yeah.
And I don't have a hard and fast answer around this. And I don't say this to be critical of other people's approaches, pedagogical approaches. But my own evolution was really about like, oh, I'm dying inside. Yeah. It wasn't even inside, it was outside. It was like I would be, I'd have a weekend where all I'm going to do is grade, and my wife would hear me like pounding my head against the desk.
the groaning.
Right. And then like, oh, not again. Oh, where I had like, at one point I had like 30 shortcut macros in my Microsoft Word. So I could like do like Control-Alt-7 in order to put like a common comment.
Yeah.
In the margins. I was processing student writing according to this surface level stuff. And I was just so fed up with it. Now this was like, 10 years before I wrote the Words Practice. So then it was a journey to get there.
Yeah.
It's like what I see, my first response after I was done freaking out about ChatGPT and wrote a piece on this at my Substack is saying that ChatGPT is not a threat, it's an opportunity.
Yeah.
It doesn't threaten anything that's worth keeping because it cannot do what we do. It doesn't think, it doesn't feel.
Yeah.
It has no worldview, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't accumulate experience in a way that allows it to, and it's like, oh, if you can, and this really frustrates me. It may frustrate you more being sort of more deeper into the technology where people want to convince me like, oh no, it's learning. ChatGPT is like when you're doing an extended series of prompts with them, like, no,
it's not. No.
This thing is a blank slate in terms of a theory of mind. Yeah. When you have a string of chats with it, it is the syntax it's able to go fetch, maybe more targeted, more interesting to you.
Yeah.
As the user, but it is not having an experience of the world, and it never will. That's the thing that when I go and do like a talk around this stuff, a school invite me in because everybody's freaking out, and I feel like my first duty is to ratchet down the freak out by reminding people what this stuff can and cannot do. It is a I don't know if you feel similarly, because you know the tech more than I do. I think it's a technological marvel. Like it's clearly a technological breakthrough in its ability to use machine learning and algorithmic processing to assemble language into responsive syntax. That blows my mind. But I don't confuse that with thinking or feeling or anything like that.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. So in a second, I want to turn to like the pragmatic, like what we can talk about what to do as teachers. But I mean, the other thing is that one of the things you kind of alluded to it a second ago, that you think writing is thinking. The way you put it in the Why They Can't Write, you say the basic unit of writing is the idea. And I think that, ideas require intention, I think, actually, and these things don't have it. So I mean, the place that I use generative AI, but it's mostly in this role-playing game I run with some of my oldest friends on the planet, like from 6th grade, from Chicagoland, and we call it Dungeons and Dads. And we have this, it's kind of like a fantasy cyberpunk thing set in Green Bay, Wisconsin, of all places. And, we'll just feed, it's jokes, right? Like there's this cyber wizard octopus that lives in the Great Lakes and is a real threat to us all. And so I'll use generative AI, Suno, it's called, to like write songs from the perspective of the octopus that it's like sending us to troll us and freak us out, And it's funny, but the reason it's funny is because I'm giving them prompts that are meaningful in a community, which is my group of friends, right? It becomes an in-joke. And the songs, by the way, suck. There's nothing good about these songs, but they work just because of the situation. It's like situationally funny, but again, that comes from me, not it, right?
Mm-hmm,
and so I think that this is kind of, until these things get intention, I feel like the core thing about we're teaching thinking, this is what we're trying to do as writing teachers, is not threatened, right? I mean...
No. I mean, and even, the example of humor is interesting because some of my first experiments were trying to get it to write something funny.
Oh, it's bad at jokes, right? It's terrible.
It can't do jokes.
Yeah.
But it can, it does have this advantage of the scenario you're illustrating, where it has no because it has no theory of mind, because it has no intentionality, it has no self-consciousness, right? And it is also good, at a kind of surface level mimicry of style if you ask it to do something.
Yeah.
So, one of the things I had to do very early on, and I actually think it may not respond to this prompt anymore because they put gates and stuff. But I asked it to write a monologue from the perspective of Jordan Peterson.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Recommending the benefit of shoving live weasels down your pants. Right?
Yeah, that's rule number 11 or something like that.
Yeah. Exactly. And it generated this text, and ultimately it needed a bunch of tweaking.
Yeah.
I think I published this on my Substack also. I think I did put it up there. But it's like the essence of it was actually pretty funny because it's able to get at some of the syntactical tics that Jordan Peterson would use, and so it can capture this essence. And in a way, it's like a Saturday Night Live cast member doing like an impression.
Yeah,
right? Like you latch on to sort of one or two surface level things, and it can create this. And so it is useful for that. It's useful for, I use it as bespoke Cliff's Notes for things I haven't read.
Yeah.
While recognizing it could have made up anything.
Yeah. You have to be careful. Yeah.
And so if I'm ultimately gonna use this, I was looking for what's this book about?
Yeah.
To see if I want to dig in, and it can be really good at summarize this book for me, and it gives you a bunch of bullet points.
Mm-hmm.
And then you go to the book and you realize it's almost like an expanded table of contents.
Yep.
It's made an outline out of the table of contents.
Mm-hmm.
This is a very useful tool if you can use it purposefully, and if you have the knowledge and background that allows you to use it in the proper context. Right.
Yep.
And the danger I see of how some folks are, to my mind, integrating it into the teaching of writing. So there's a couple of things.
Yep.
There's a continuum, right? There's the burn it with fire. I want to ignore it exists. I think this is a mistake.
Totally.
This technology is in the world. We can't wish it away. It's going to be something like I cannot deny that it's of use to me.
Yeah.
Right. So it clearly has use in the same way. Like I at some point along the line, I went from like telling my students never use Wikipedia because it's unreliable to, you know what, the first place you might want to go when you're looking at an unfamiliar topic is Wikipedia. Right.
Yeah.
So I think we have to be forthright about that stuff. On the other pole are the people who are like, ChatGPT is now going to be indispensable to everything you ever do. And blah, blah. I mean, I think that's nuts too. So in terms of how we integrate this or think about teaching writing, I do the exact same way. Writing is thinking.
Yeah.
ChatGPT is a tool. I've seen some people who claim that ChatGPT is a useful tool for like brainstorming and their own thinking and this kind of stuff. If it's true for you, that's fine. It has not been true for me. It could be unique to my process. In the same way, like I don't do outlines and other people swear by outlines.
Interesting.
I do, I think, right. If writing is thinking and the root of thinking is an idea, although I've since amended that. I think there's like if ideas are the atom, we have subatomic particles like a notion or a noticing or an inkling, right? These sorts of things. I explore those, and then I'll be writing, and then I'll think, oh, these things go next, and I'll like hit a bunch of returns, go down the page, and say like, talk about this, right? That's my form of outlining. So this stuff does have use. There are some people I've seen. I watched like a 12-minute long video of somebody using it wasn't ChatGPT. It was a GPT enabled outlining, brainstorming, writing thing, and to write a blog post. And he went through it and he used it. And I won't throw this guy under the bus, but he wrote a blog post and he showed all this stuff. And I'm like, I could have written that blog post in half the time it took you to wrestle it out of that technology. Now, I've been writing for 12 years. I've been writing a blog post every week. So that's like, the groove is deep in that particular part of my record. But if we want students to learn to write, we have to give them practice thinking. If we employ GPT in any way as an end run around thinking, I think we're denying them an experience that's necessary. And so that's sort of the line I draw.
So, go ahead.
No, I was just saying it can be useful. Like it can be a substitute for non-thinking activities. But if it's a thinking activity, I think particularly in a learning occasion, students have to do it.
So let's say, I mean, how do you think about process around this stuff? Because it's like, let's say I give a prompt for a writing experience, no longer called an essay, right? I can, let's just say I'm going to assume that some things that come back to me on the first run will be GPT generated. I think that's what a lot of people are finding. But what is the process that you have after that first step to make sure that it becomes a process of thinking rather than just more text generation? Do you hear what I'm saying?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, a lot of it is like the writing will start before they're doing any writing.
Yeah.
Through thinking, through observation, through gathering of momentum. So, I don't want, it's very rare, other than a kind of spontaneous writing exercise, which I will use, but which 95% of the time is something students are going to do in front of me in class and watch them do it. Other than that, almost every occasion I have students write, they have some massive material already gathered, right? Yeah. Like you're going to build a house. If an essay or a piece of writing is a house, we got to have some bricks and wood and nail gun on site because we're going to start using that. If I just give a prompt, which is really hard, right? Like if I just give a prompt and say, write something, the temptation to use GPT, particularly if it's going to be graded, particularly if it's going to be assessed in any way, as something activity that I had to do for the class, the temptation is to use it is going to be there. Yeah. Not because they don't want to think, but because there is an incentive to check this box.
Sure.
Right? The frame I use around this is students doing an end run around learning, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Doing an end run around learning is nothing new. When I was in college,
Thank you.
When I was in college, this is how long ago it was, but I was at the University of Illinois. A bunch of my first year courses were like huge lectures in Follinger Auditorium.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, me too. Amen.
The 2000 seater,
yeah.
right? So
yeah.
you're taking Econ 101 or SpeechComm 178 in Follinger Auditorium.
Yeah.
And the professors would provide all of their notes,
Yep.
like the overhead slides, in the copy shop at the start of the semester. You could buy them.
Yep.
And the theory was you were supposed to take notes on those things as you went. I just bought those and then read the textbook. And I would go to maybe 15 or 20% of the class periods. I'd go on test days. And I'd get my B.
Preach, brother. Me too. This is my Follinger and everything. This is it.
Yeah, I would be fine, right? I didn't care about the class. I didn't care to learn anything. Yeah. I still remember my Econ 101 professor he wouldn't come out. His TA would come out with it was an overhead scroll, like so not individual sheets, like a scroll of overhead of acetate, and the TA would put it on the machine. He would scroll to the spot that the professor had left off the previous lecture. Professor would walk out from the wings. He would talk for 50 minutes. And at 50 minutes, almost no matter where he was, he would stop. And then the TA would come retrieve the scroll.
It's like a religious ritual. Yeah,
exactly.
I love it.
and pretty quickly, like, again, maybe this is the Midwestern thing. I was like, that doesn't help. What am I doing? What am I doing here? This class is at 8 a.m.
Yeah.
This is crazy. And so if we allow students to enter that mentality of why am I doing this? This is pointless. There's nothing for me to gain here. If I can find a way to not do this and still get credit, of course I'm going to do that. Of course I'm going to do that. That was the story of my college career.
Yeah.
If I can do that and get credit, if I can not do that and get credit, why wouldn't I do that? Now, I was a bad student.
Me too,
I was unmotivated and didn't know what I want to do and only tried in certain courses. But if you got me in a course that was interesting to me, you couldn't stop me.
Yeah.
Right. Like I was the best student in the class.
Yep.
And we can't expect that 100% of the time. I'm not like, every professor in every class has to get students so fired up that they want to run through a brick wall for art history or technical writing or anything. That's unreasonable. But at the very least, there should be a base level invitation of
to meaningfulness, as you put it.
Of meaningfulness, of curiosity, right? The students are human. They're not defective, but they are people, and with all the flaws we all come with. So if we can keep that in mind, you stand at least half a chance of giving them something meaningful when you start with the course, and knowing that GPT is out there.
Yeah.
As an easy, convenient, cost-free tool for doing stuff that may pass muster in your class, you have to be aware of that. Otherwise, more and more students will employ it. Right? It's just it's human nature.
So I have a couple quick follow-ups as a way to kind of wind things down. So I just saw a tweet. You were bashing. So I think it's probably the people who are mostly on the burn it down side of things, right? Have been turning to like Blue Books as the answer. And I have been a Blue Book user, I have to say, in recent years. So I felt castigated and morally upbraided by your tweet in a pleasing way, though, in a pleasing way. And but I think that this is something people are like, we got to go back to Socrates or like go to the Blue Book. And I thought you had a wonderful take on why that is not actually the way to go. So can you say why we should not turn to Blue Books as our response?
Well, let me caveat my own response first, saying there's nothing wrong with asking students to do work in front of you.
Yeah.
Right. In fact, one of the things I did in my writing courses over the years was steadily increase the amount of time I gave students in class to do work.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of good reasons to do it, but you can create community around it.
Yeah.
You can, particularly if they're doing the kind of work, I would have it often around like research. Like we're going to look stuff up.
Yeah.
We're going to find our ideas and start to follow those ideas. That's an area where like real-time feedback is particularly useful. Like you loom over a student's shoulder and you see something they're doing in terms of like how they're searching. You're like, no, let me give you a tip. Right?
Yeah.
So that is useful. My reaction in that tweet was really against a blue book embracing attitude that is really wrapped up around notions of kind of authoritarian control of students, as opposed to an experience where students get to demonstrate what they learn. In theory, a blue book exam can be a good way for students to demonstrate learning, right? In practice, particularly the way that I absorbed these experiences when I was in college and then witnessing this as a teacher was this is an occasion where the assessment criteria often is focused on the most surface level indicators.
You're right.
Of coherence,
facility, all these things.
The sort of pseudo academic BS that that some of us get good at churning out quite quickly. Yeah. When I use this example when I had the tweet thread, like in college, anything that required like a research paper, I dropped. But if you're going to have 3 or 4 in-class essay exams, I'm there. Right? Yeah. Because I know I can write faster and more surface level fluent than the vast majority of the people around me.
Yeah.
And so if I can just come armed with like 3 things that demonstrate some engagement with the content of the course, I'm going to crush this thing. You know, there's like a Russian history course that was actually pretty interesting. I would go to the lectures because like this is interesting, but I didn't absorb any of it and I didn't study for even a moment.
Yeah.
For these exams, but like I came armed knowing the difference between like the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, and just having that and being able to write like 3 sentences around each of those things. All of a sudden, I know I'm going to get an A on that question.
Right, exactly.
On the exam, right?
Yeah.
So it really is like if we're going to give blue book exams, you have to attach some assessment criteria to it that goes beyond the glib, and goes beyond the surface level fluency. If it's just like, I know they didn't use ChatGPT, but I've incentivized glibness, 90 minutes of pseudo academic BS, how is that an improvement?
Yeah.
Other than we get to maintain, that sort of facade of quote unquote academic integrity.
Yeah.
This is a word. Academic integrity is a 2-word concept that I often find interesting and fault with because the lengths we go to preserve certain types of academic integrity often get in the way of student learning.
Yeah.
Because being cops or surveillance or the one-person panopticon as students work in front of us and do a test in front of us. What good is that, right? Yeah. I had an email exchange with somebody who wrote to me who the other day who's like, they said, I have to believe that we're going to come up with ChatGPT detection that works. And I said, no, you shouldn't believe that because it's not going to happen. It's not possible.
I'm with you, man. That cannot be the
I'm
answer.
aware of the companies that say they've cracked it.
Yeah.
And some of them sort of work.
Yeah.
Sometimes. And at the end, I'm like, now I have something to tell you about the plagiarism detection software too. I wanted to be, I didn't want to be mean, but I wanted to just be like, what are what are the value, like what are you valuing when you say, I want something that can detect GPT use, right?
Yeah.
Like, if we can give students something they want to do, they'll be less likely to use GPT. Is it a guarantee? Absolutely not. Are there any guarantees? Never.
Yeah.
So you just, the message I had for this person who emailed me, or I gave a talk at a community college a week and a half ago, is you got to work the problem.
Yeah.
It's a problem. Teaching has always been a problem. It will never not be a problem, but it's an interesting problem.
Yeah.
And it's a problem where you can definitely make progress, and it's a comprehensible problem. But you also have to give yourself the slack to be like, oh, well, yeah, somebody's going to use GPT.
Yeah.
Some students are going to blow it off. Someone's going to go to the copy shop and get all my lecture notes.
And
be able to get a B on my exam, right?
Yeah, or pay for people to do their essay. I mean, there's so much cheating already.
It's all there. So if you'll, what I sensed in this person who emailed me was they were driving themselves insane.
Yeah.
Over a problem that they can't solve.
Yep.
And, it's sort of like, it's like just a giving over of yourself to reality and recognizing like, this is the world we live in, and you have to do the best you can do and not beat yourself up over the fact that certain things are going to happen that are not what you wish would happen. But if you're working the problem and doing the best you can do, a lot of good things are going to happen. You got to try to focus on the positive.
I wanted to just kind of like, as a way of wrapping up, I want to recognize kind of like, and kind of, I don't know, kind of my own woke style, that my own privilege, and say like, I have a very light teaching load. I don't teach undergrads as much as many of my colleagues do. And, but more important, some of my friends have like 4 teaching loads in writing centered classes. And you might've been there too, if you were adjuncting. And so, I just wanted to kind of recognize that that this probably presents problems for some people that I don't have, because I know what I can do in my classes to make writing assignments better. But do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, is it just kind of, first of all, I think that it goes to your book about the future of the higher education system, and that we've created inhumane systems where people are being asked to do things that are bonkers and aren't good for them or students in any way whatsoever. So that needs to change. But are there any kind of like nuts and bolts suggestions beyond what you've already said for people who are in that position?
Yeah, that was my life, right?
Yeah,
like when I was at Virginia Tech, teaching comm skills, I had 4 sections of somewhere around 20 students. It might have been 22, something like that.
Yeah.
Very, very hard, involving, busy, all those things, right? It would push me to the limits of my capacity.
Yeah.
And I had many semesters like that. I had a semester at Clemson teaching a 4-4, where I had 170 students in writing intensive courses, right?
Yeah.
This becomes impossible to manage. And a big portion of why they can't write is not about writing pedagogy, but about the structure of education. Yeah. Right? So if there's, I don't know if you have administrators who listen to your podcast, but if they do, here's my advice about, if you want better writing taught at your institution, have the number of students that each instructor is responsible for, and the quality of writing instruction in your institution will go up exponentially.
Yeah.
Right. Not once in my career did I experience the recommended disciplinary student loads for teaching first year writing, which is 3 sections of 15 students or a total of 45.
Wow.
Not once.
Yeah.
Right. So, if we want to think about writing matters, we want students writing, okay, let's create the conditions that allows this to happen. That said, we have to live in the world that we're in. And so practically, I think one of the things we have to recognize is there is no such thing as a sort of GPT-proof prompt.
Yep.
There are, just if you isolated the prompts out of the writer's practice, there are some that are pretty GPT-proof because they require a kind of experiential aspect of it that it's very difficult to fake.
Yeah.
and GPT would struggle with, or to get it to do something good would take so much work, you might as well just do it.
Yeah.
That said, it is impossible to follow the process of in the experiences in the writer's practice that require the generation of numerous artifacts along the way, heading towards the final experience, which would be something like an essay, and then adding on reflection. This is something that simply can't be done by GPT.
That. Yeah. Yeah.
Or if a student were going to try to use GPT to generate all those words, again, they essentially are doing the work you asked them to do.
The prompt would be so damn long that it may as well just write it.
Right.
Yeah.
So they've figured out a way to use this syntax generating tool to do to help them.
Yeah.
They're doing the thinking, and the syntax generation tool is generating the syntax that reflects that. That's an interesting outcome.
Yeah.
So it really is about honoring the process that leads to students learning. And, I do these talks and lectures on this stuff, but it's really around what I call learning oriented questions. That is thinking about your own subject. What do you want students to know? What attitudes do you want to have them to have towards your own subject? And then what do you want them to be able to do with your material? It's not just they can write an essay reflecting that they've absorbed some portion of the information that you've conveyed over the course of the semester. It's figure out something that they can do.
Yeah.
That shows the integration of the new knowledge and information you have in their course with the underlying skills that allow people to demonstrate it in your discipline. And in a lot of ways, this is easier for writing than other subjects, because writing is by its nature experiential.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not impossible for anything. But it does often require a kind of unlearning of the kinds of artifacts we've allowed to stand in for students demonstrating proficiency, that we have to just rethink about these things. I have an example from an art history professor. Actually, I learned this was at Virginia Tech too, where rather than giving the names, dates, significance, exams, right, where you just sort of fill in blanks, she created an assignment that required students to curate a room in a museum where they would write their own descriptions of the artworks. But then the key was they had to write like just a 2 or 3 page, like 750 word statement of intention as the curator for why they've brought these works together around a theme and what meaning they are and what the audience, the viewers of the art are supposed to get from it. This is an amazing assignment for, what was a gen ed art history course that could have been the cram for the exam, forget it the next day. Instead, she turned it into a kind of an art appreciation course where students were exposed to less art, but in a much deeper way. And those students, they'll go into a museum, they'll look at art, and they'll remember, this teacher taught me how to look at art and think about art. And that is an enduring experience oriented around learning that's far better than like the Jeopardy level trivia. Right?
Yeah.
That could pass muster in those sorts of classes in the past. We know better now. I think, and the other practical thing I would tell people is get curious about that aspect of your job, the teaching part of it.
Yeah.
Like work it as a problem and develop your teaching practice, the skills, knowledge, attitudes, habits of mind of teachers. And what I think in most cases, what I've observed, sort of working on the other side of it, helping people develop these skills, is it opens up fresh possibilities for people's careers in higher ed. Not that they want to change jobs, but it's like, their own work is invigorated. By thinking about it more deeply. Like they've been bored by their own work, right?
Happens, man.
And this allows for that freshness to the task. I did it because I was I had to do it to survive.
Mhm.
But if you're Lee Vinsel and you're just teaching a couple of grad courses, and it's like, it's fun. You go nuts. You can do whatever you want.
Yeah.
Right. You're tenured, right? They can't,
Safe, man. So
they can't touch
safe
you.
and boring.
You're bulletproof. No, it's good. I mean, that's, that's what tenure is for. Tenure should be to be skeptical. Tenure should be there to experiment. It's a horrible thing to waste by just, rolling out the same playbook semester after semester.
John, I knew I was going to have such a good time with you, and I did. I cannot tell you how excited I am. I mean, first of all, people should read your old books, your published books, but I can't wait for this new book. I know I'm going to be pushing it on people, so expect an invitation here back to tech eventually. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today, man.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. You can reach us with questions, comments, and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or by following me on Twitter at STS_news or on YouTube at People's Things. Our podcast is distributed by the New Books Network, the leading platform for academic podcasts, so that you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Peoples and Things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Joe Fort is the producer for the podcast, and Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. This podcast and other Peoples and Things programming are produced in affiliation with Virginia Tech Publishing and supported by the Center for Humanities and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. For the entire Peoples and Things team, I am Lee Vinsel. And most importantly, I want to thank you for listening. Thanks.